The sedan sat in the driveway, its paint dulled by a thick layer of road dust. David ran a finger through the grime, leaving a clean streak against the gray metal. Beside it, the street told a different story. Gleaming SUVs lined the curb, polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the morning sun. A neighbor pulled into the adjacent driveway, the engine of his vehicle purring with a controlled, expensive hum. He climbed out, glanced briefly at David and Sarah, and then turned away, his attention fixed on his own driveway. David did not look at the neighbor. He kept his eyes on the sedan. Sarah stood beside him, her hands tucked into her pockets, watching the street with a steady, unblinking gaze. The air was still. The sound of a closing car door echoed sharply, followed by the heavy thud of a trunk lid. They were the outliers on the block, the unremarkable couple with the aging car, hidden in plain sight. They stood there for a long moment, ignoring the judgment of the gleaming machine surrounding them. They were not waiting for a ride. They were waiting for the clock to strike the final second of a 30-year countdown. When the moment came, David pulled his phone from his pocket. He tapped the screen, and the world they had built in silence finally began to reveal itself. The memory surfaced with the clarity of a photograph. 30 years ago, the kitchen table had been too small for the pile of paperwork spread across it. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting sharp shadows on the unpaid invoices and student loan statements. David looked up. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of an aging refrigerator. Sarah sat across from him, her gaze locked on the balance totals written in red ink. They had been trying to keep pace with the world around them, buying what they thought they needed to look successful. It was a race they were losing. David pushed the papers aside, the friction of the edges against the wood surface sounding loud in the small space. He reached out, took Sarah by the hand, and stopped the cycle. What if we stopped trying to look successful and started building real freedom instead? Sarah did not hesitate. She looked at the bills, then back at him, and nodded. That moment erased the pressure of outside expectations. They stopped measuring their lives by the brands they owned or the labels they wore. They decided to rewrite the terms of their existence, prioritizing control over consumption. It was the point of no return, the moment they walked away from the standard path to carve out a different, quieter future. The following Monday, the theory met the asphalt. While their neighbors cycled through new leases, David and Sarah returned to the garage. The old sedan needed a new alternator, a job that left David with grease-stained knuckles and a sore back for 3 days. He spent his evenings under the hood, wrenching bolts while the neighbors' new vehicles hissed into their driveways, silent and effortless. One morning, the neighbor from across the street walked over, eyeing the open hood of the sedan. "Still nursing that relic?" he asked, his tone heavy with pity. David wiped his hands on a rag, felt the grit under his nails, and smiled. He did not explain the logic of avoiding a monthly payment. He just nodded and went back to the engine. Peer pressure was a constant, low-frequency hum. It lived in the polished paint of the cars they did not buy and the catalogs tossed into their recycling bin. Every time they tightened a bolt or patched a leak, they felt the weight of that judgment. Yet, with every repair, the car kept running. They were learning that discipline was not a single grand gesture, but a series of small, quiet refusals. Each time they chose the wrench over the dealership, they felt the tether of debt loosen just a fraction more. The neighbors saw a broken car. David and Sarah saw a tool that bought them their own time. The focus shifted from the garage to the bank account, while their peers gutted their kitchens, tearing down cabinets and replacing granite for the sake of trends. David and Sarah remained in their original space. They watched from their window as delivery trucks brought new appliances to the house next door. The sound of saws and hammers echoed through the neighborhood for weeks. Every time a new loan was signed on the street, David sat at their modest desk and transferred the equivalent sum into their index funds. It became a ritual. They treated every paycheck like a puzzle. Instead of financing a new lifestyle, they systematically funneled the remainder into low-cost assets. The numbers on the screen were just digits, but they saw them as silent employees. Every dollar invested was a worker that never slept, never complained, and never took a vacation. They tracked the compounding interest with the same focus David once used to track the engine's timing. The progress was invisible to the outside world. Their walls remained the same color, their floors showed the same wear, and their furniture stayed exactly where it had been for years. but beneath the surface, the tide was turning. The gap between what they earned and what they spent grew wider, and with each transfer, the weight of financial gravity began to lift. They were building an empire of time, one transaction at a time. The pressure was not just physical, it was digital. Advertisements invaded their screens, flashing curated lives of luxury and ease. Sarah would scroll through social media and see friends on vacations they had financed with plastic, their smiles perfectly lit and filtered. The urge to compare was a persistent itch. One Tuesday, a notification popped up on her phone. A limited-time offer on a high-end appliance, something they could afford but did not need. She paused. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She looked around their living room, at the scuffed floorboards and the dated curtains. For a heartbeat, the desire to upgrade felt like a necessity. She walked into the kitchen and found David staring at the same glowing screen on his laptop. They did not speak, but they saw the trap. Instead of clicking buy, they stood together and closed the tabs. They took a breath and forced themselves to visualize the alternative. The years of freedom those dollars represented. They turned the impulse into a game of subtraction. Every time they resisted the pull of consumption, they calculated how many months of work that purchase would have cost them. They treated the urge to spend as a signal to invest instead. The noise from the outside world remained, but it no longer held the power to disrupt their focus. They had learned to look past the label and see the cost of the trade-off. Years blurred into a rhythm of work and quiet accumulation. Their professional paths climbed, promotions arrived, and paychecks swelled. Yet their daily existence remained locked in a static, deliberate loop. They refused the trap of lifestyle inflation. As their friends traded cars for newer models every 3 years, David and Sarah drove the same high-mileage machines until the paint began to fade. The contrast between their life and the world around them grew sharp. Neighbors whispered about their lack of ambition, oblivious to the reality hidden behind the modest facade of their home. Every raise they received was silently diverted into the machine. The compounding effect, once a slow, almost imperceptible trickle, began to gather real weight. It became a tide, interest earned on interest, capital gains feeding back into the principal. The money was working harder than they ever could. They watched the balance sheets grow, a secret victory recorded in numbers that nobody else could see. The house felt smaller, the furniture more worn, but the gap between their spending and their assets was now a chasm. They were no longer just saving. They were engineering a future that was already inevitable. The pressure to look successful had vanished, replaced by the quiet, heavy momentum of total financial independence. It was just another Tuesday. The sun hit the kitchen table at the same angle it had for 3 decades. David sat at the laptop, the screen reflecting the dim light of the room. Sarah stood by the window, watching the neighbors pull out of their driveways in their polished, financed vehicles. They had spent 30 years building this moment from nothing. It started at this very table, with a stack of bills and a shared, quiet decision to choose a different path. David hovered his finger over the trackpad. The portal glowed, waiting for the final command. He looked at Sarah. She nodded, her face steady. He felt the weight of every sacrifice, every skipped vacation, every repaired appliance, every late night of work converge into a single blinking cursor. He pressed down. The click echoed in the quiet room. A confirmation message appeared on the screen, simple and final. The portal accepted the input. The screen refreshed, showing the end of their professional obligation. He pushed the laptop back. The air in the room felt different, lighter. 30 years of disciplined pressure had vanished in an instant. They were no longer building for the future. The future had arrived. They looked at each other, the silence between them no longer heavy with anxiety, but filled with the sudden, overwhelming realization of total freedom. The news of their departure spread through the cul-de-sac like a sudden draft. By the next afternoon, a neighbor was at their front gate, his eyes darting across their peeling paint and the mismatched garden chairs. He stood there, leaning in, waiting for the reveal. He wanted the secret. He wanted to hear about a winning stock, a hidden inheritance, or a lucky real estate flip. He looked at their worn living room through the open screen door, his expression tight with a mix of envy and disbelief. "How did you two manage to retire so early?" he asked, his voice dripping with the expectation of a shortcut. He tapped his foot, pen ready to record a golden nugget of wisdom. David stood by the herb garden, hands still stained from the soil. He looked at the man, then back at the quiet, debt-free house behind him. "We spent less than we earned for a long time," David said. The neighbor froze. He blinked, clearly waiting for the rest of the sentence. When none came, his shoulders slumped. He looked at David with genuine disappointment, his gaze sliding away as if the answer were a cheap trick. He turned and walked back toward his own driveway, dismissing the simple, brutal truth that had bought them their lives. The gate clicked shut, leaving them in a silence that felt heavy with possibility. David looked at his hands, then at the house that was finally, truly theirs. For decades, the constant hum of debt and expectations had sat at the base of his skull like a physical weight. He waited for it to surge back, for the panic of a missed deadline or the pressure of a rising bill. But there was only stillness. Sarah stepped closer, her shoulders dropping an inch, the rigid posture of a lifetime of labor finally beginning to soften. They had spent 30 years trading the sharp, fleeting dopamine hits of consumption for the quiet, permanent bedrock of assets. It was a massive, silent exchange. The shock of it hit them in waves. They were not waiting for a weekend, or a holiday, or a break. The clock no longer dictated their pulse. They stood in the center of their own lives, completely unmoored from the machine that had demanded their energy for so long. The realization was sharp, cold, and immensely liberating. They had reached the end of the long path, and the prize was not a luxury. It was the ability to exist without the constant, gnawing demand of the next paycheck. They walked out into the garden as the morning sun climbed over the fence. The soil was damp and cool beneath their boots. Around them, the neighborhood was waking up in a frenzy of engines, slamming doors, and hurried footsteps. People were rushing to meet schedules they did not control, chasing goals set by others. David and Sarah stood perfectly still. They listened to the wind moving through the leaves, a sound that no longer signaled a ticking clock or a wasted hour. It was simply the sound of presence. They had spent their lives ignoring the siren call of status, refusing to trade their future for a temporary reflection of success. Now, the space around them was entirely their own. There were no bosses to report to, no debt collectors waiting in the shadows, and no frantic need to perform for the eyes of others. They had invested their years into the only asset that truly mattered. As they watched a bird land on the fence, they realized they were no longer trying to look rich or keep pace with a world that never stopped to breathe. They were finally, completely free. The silence in the garden was not empty. It was the sound of total agency, earned through the quiet, steady discipline of a lifetime.